Hey everybody, welcome back to a new video. Do you wonder if the development of ever-increasing higher megapixel camera bodies are worth it and part of your photography future? Do you aspire to own one? Do you even need one for big prints? Or does the recent availability of upscaling software even up the battle? In this video, I'm going to walk you through the battle between high and low megapixel cameras to help you decide which one would be best for you. You'll want to stay till the end because I'm going to dispel one of the most commonly quoted differences between low and high megapixel cameras. And it's so counter to popular opinion, the result may surprise you. My name is Simon D'Entremont, and I'm a professional nature and wildlife photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. First off, a disclaimer, there are people in the comments below using my photo and pretending to be me, offering you prizes and asking you to get in touch via Telegram. Do not engage, these are scammers. Please report them. Let's start off by getting a handle on the language you're using here to make sure we're on the same page. The megapixel count of your camera is how many million pixels its sensor has. My Canon R6 that I'm recording with right now has a full frame sensor. That is, the dimensions are 35 by 24 millimeters. This is pretty standard across all full-frame cameras. What differs is how many pixels are crammed into that space. The R6 has 5,472 by 3,648 pixels, which is about 20 million pixels, or 20 megapixels for short. This Canon R5 has 8,192 by 5,464 pixels, or 45 megapixels. If there are more megapixels crammed into the same area, the R5's pixels are smaller, which can theoretically capture finer detail. Now, if you look at a crop sensor camera, like my APS-C Canon 7D Mark II, which has a sensor of 24 by 16 millimeters, you could have the same megapixels as my R6, but to squeeze into a smaller space, they'd need to be even smaller pixels. In this video, we're going to keep the comparisons of similar size sensors against each other, so we're comparing apples to apples. The comparison of different size sensors is a complex topic for another video. So let's look at the issues one needs to consider when trying to decide how many megapixels your next camera needs to have. One thing that gets raised is, well, I want to make large prints, so I need a high megapixel count camera to have enough resolution, right? Not exactly. The figure that gets tossed around on a regular basis for the resolution needed for printed material is 300 pixels per inch, or PPI. This is what magazines often want, even if many magazines are printed at 150 PPI. And just to note as well, dots per inch and pixels per inch are used interchangeably, but dots per inch is your printer, pixels per inch is your digital photo. So my 20 megapixel R6 has a sensor resolution of 5,472 by 3,648. And if we needed to use 300 of these pixels for each inch, that would allow us to make a print of 18 inches by 12 inches, right? Yes, if we need to stick to the 300 PPI. The trick is we don't. And the reason is viewing distance. My Canon 5D Mark IV had 30 megapixels and had a resolution of 6,720 by 4,480. So at this 300 DPI standard, I could only print it at 22 by 15 inches. Why then can I have this printed at 20 by 30 inches and it looks fine and detailed, even if it's only 224 PPI? Because as a print gets larger, you naturally look at it from farther away. And at that distance, the resolution you can discern with your eyes gets less and less. You may be saying, well, 224 PPI isn't that far off 300. Well, you're right. So I printed this monster at 30 by 40 inches, which is 150 PPI. My R6 for the same photo would have been at 135 PPI. It's still fine. Why? Because while I look at it from 18 inches away, there may be less detail than a smaller print. Who looks at a print this large from this close? Almost nobody. That's because the distance people will look at a print is usually 1.5 times its diameter to get it all in one view. That means a print this size will be looked at from 5 or 6 feet away. And at that distance, my eye can only resolve 100 DPI at best. So at this ratio of viewing distance, the larger and larger you print, the farther and farther you stand back to look at it, requiring less resolution. So both my R6 at 135 DPI and my 5D Mark IV at 150 ppi have enough resolution to be printed this large for most applications. This also means that if your camera resolution can make an acceptable print at a small size like 18 by 14 inches, that'll be looked at from 18 inches away, like on a magazine, it can almost be printed at any size. And in case you're thinking, well, this can't be extrapolated forever, can it? It can, and most of you see this every day. Billboards. They're 14 by 48 feet. And how many DPI? A measly 15, a 2 megapixel image. That's because at 50 feet or 15 meters, our eyes can only resolve 12 DPI. So we see that a high megapixel camera isn't needed for large prints. Any 20 or 24 megapixel camera can be printed very large. The exception is a large print where you want people to stand up really close and go through the intimate details of the shot. But if your print is over a couch, for example, people can't even do that because you can't get that close to it. And by the way, I've seen people try to show off the benefit of higher megapixel cameras in prints by making a huge digital sized image on their computer, like this 30 by 40 inch print, and zooming it to life size on the screen and printing an 8 by 10 inch cutout of a 30 by 40 image, and then comparing a high and low megapixel cameras from 18 inches away. This is a silly comparison. No one would look at a 30 by 40 image from the same distance as an 8 by 10. This is like taking an 8 by 10 inch cutout of a billboard and asking someone to look at it from 2 feet away. Of course, it will look pixelated and low resolution, but it's designed to be that way. Now, to be clear, the higher megapixel photo will show more detail when pixel peeped up close. So use this advice as per how you would expect the viewing experience to be. If you pixel peep, or you have clients that do, you can still favor the high megapixel camera, but in most cases, you don't need it for large prints. What's the largest print of acceptable sharpness you've ever printed with a low megapixel camera? Let us know in the comments below. I want to see who has the record. So why else would you want a high megapixel camera? For better photos online like Facebook or Instagram, or for your website, right? A full HD 1080 computer monitor has a resolution of 1920 by 1080. That's a whopping 2 megapixels. A 4K monitor is 3840 by 2160. That's around 8 megapixels. You can see where this is going. People looking at your images from a 50 or 60 megapixel camera will never be able to discern the difference between that and a lower megapixel camera. In fact, on Facebook and Instagram, anything over 2048 pixels on the long side is getting resized by them anyway. Here's a photo of a wood duck that I took. It was cropped from the original frame of 45 megapixels, so there are 18 megapixels left. Now here's a resized photo of the same image, resized to 2048 by 1609, or 3 megapixels. If I switch between the two on a 27-inch monitor, I can't tell them apart. Here's the same shot of a willet taken with a 20 megapixel R6 and 45 megapixel R5. At full screen size, I can't tell them apart. So if you're getting a higher megapixel camera so you can get better digital images for your computer, you're not going to see much of a difference. Okay, what about another reason you might buy a high megapixel camera, like cropping? Here's that bird shot from earlier where I shot it with both cameras using a tack sharp lens, a Canon 500mm f4. When I look at them at the same size, full frame, I can't tell any difference. But let's say I want to make a really tight crop on this willet to really show off the fine detail. In this case, cropped to the same size in the frame, the higher megapixel R5 will reveal more detail. So when it comes to cropping, this is where the high megapixel camera shines. You can get sharper, more detailed photos from deep crops, and you can print them larger, as deep crops from low megapixel cameras may not leave you with enough pixels to meet our earlier thresholds, even at farther viewing distances. Combined with a super sharp lens, you can get spectacular results. Here's a deep crop of a photo of a flying duck I took that shows off how deeply you can crop in and still get usable images. This is maybe a good time to discuss upscaling software, which is starting to become more widely available and used. This software increases the size of your files as measured in pixels and uses some algorithms to fill in the blanks with more pixels. The smarter the software, the more it will enhance details and minimize upscaling the noise in your image and avoid the photo looking like it was upscaled at all. Remember that photo of a wood duck that I resized down to 3 megapixels? Well, if I use resizing software to get it back up to the same resolution as the original 18 megapixel image, it actually looks very similar and is clearly less blocky looking than the 3 megapixel image in this extreme crop. This software is getting smarter all the time and is starting to cut into the advantage of high megapixel cameras by allowing a resolution increase to lower megapixel photos, while still keeping a nice sharpness and clarity to the photo. And now another piece of information that may rub people the wrong way, because it goes against traditional wisdom. Everyone says that lower megapixel cameras have less noise than higher megapixel cameras. So if you want to shoot in dark locations or photograph the Milky Way, you should get a lower megapixel camera. Well, not exactly. There's a couple of things at play here. First, most software allows you to zoom into 100% magnification on an image by clicking on the image. The problem is this 100% crop is a deeper crop that is a higher zoom on a high megapixel camera image than a low megapixel one. Because zooming in further makes noise look worse, right off the bat you think your high megapixel camera is much noisier. Now if you zoom them into the same amount, you will indeed find that the lower megapixel camera looks better. That's because the individual pixels are larger on a low megapixel camera, they collect more light each, and it gives you a better ratio of light to noise called a signal to noise ratio. But if you take a similar photo with a high megapixel camera and apply noise reduction, even basic noise reduction like in Lightroom or Photoshop, you end up with a similar amount of noise and a similar amount of detail. So it's a wash. So in the end, there are lots of reasons to choose a lower megapixel camera, but lower noise really isn't one of them. When I go out to shoot Milky Way shots like these, I grab either the R5 or the R6, whichever is closest. I should also point out that even when a higher megapixel camera can theoretically outperform a lower megapixel camera, those advantages aren't always capitalized upon in real life. One reason is lens sharpness. If your lenses aren't sharp enough, you may not actually be able to get all the advantages out of your high megapixel camera. If you like browsing through details, you can go to a website called DxOMark, where they review camera sensors and lenses. On this site, you can look up lenses to see the rating for what they call perceptual megapixels, or basically lens sharpness in megapixels. So a lens with 20 megapixel sharpness can resolve the resolution of a 20 megapixel camera. Any more resolution is wasted. So a cheap kit lens with 12 megapixel sharpness won't do any better on either of my 2 full frame cameras, regardless of the resolution. On the other hand, on a super sharp lens like this 500mm f4, will get better performance from a high megapixel camera body, as it can resolve over 30 megapixels in sharpness. Another reason is heat diffraction. Heat haze from mixing air of different temperatures or radiating from a warm source like pavement will make the photos from any camera mushy. Having more megapixels won't save you. So how many megapixels do you need? If you're going to crop significantly, or your particular genre has clients that are particular about pixel dimensions, or you plan to print very large where people will be entertaining themselves inches away looking for details, then a high megapixel camera may be right for you. There can also be other features of high megapixel cameras that will influence your decision, like having a better autofocus system, dual card slots, or better video features. These are all features sometimes paired with high-end, high megapixel cameras. But as we've seen, 20 to 24 megapixels is plenty for most other genres of photography. They're also usually cheaper, take cheaper memory cards, require less storage, and leaves you money for lenses, often the better place to invest a large chunk of your photography budget. In short, don't be afraid of lower megapixel cameras. If your budget is tight and your plan is to spend a lot for a high megapixel camera and only have enough money left for a cheap lens, you're likely not doing yourself a favor. A lower megapixel camera and a great lens will likely outperform it. If you liked this video and it was helpful to you, give it a like and YouTube will show it to even more people. I hope you can put this advice to use and get the right camera for you so you can go out there and get some amazing photos. I know you can do it.